Welcome to Transformational Blueprints, the podcast that's here to tackle the big question. Why do so many transformation programs fall short, and what can we do about it? I'm Mario Michaels, founder and director of Synaxia Group, and I'm thrilled to have you join me. In this series, we go beyond theory, bringing you first-hand stories and insights from some of the world's top architecture and transformation leaders. It's all about sharing real-world lessons, sparking fresh ideas, and giving back to the architecture community. So whether you're looking to learn, be inspired, or stay ahead of the curve, grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive in together. Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking to Oliver Cronk about sustainable technology. Ollie leads the technology, strategy, research and development at ScottLogic. ScottLogic are a UK-based B Corp software and data consultancy. Ollie also leads the sustainable technology practice. He and his team publish an open source tech carbon standard to guide technology sustainability. With over 25 years in technology, Ollie's experience includes application development, solution and enterprise and chief architect positions in energy, environment, finance, government and tech, gaining experience across cloud architecture, emerging technologies, data and AI platforms, and sustainability. Currently serving as ScottLogic's technology director, Ollie takes a big picture view, balancing strategic vision with pragmatic and practical solutions. An engaging speaker and facilitator, Ollie created Architect Tomorrow about 5 years ago, which is a community and podcast focused on the future of tech, careers, emerging technologies, and sustainability. Ollie, welcome to this side of the podcast.
Thank you, Mario. It's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Does it feel a bit weird being interviewed rather than the other way around?
It's funny. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm feeling super comfortable being on this end, but we'll see how it goes.
Well, if we could just start with, I've given sort of a high level overview there, but if we could just start with sort of how you got to where you are now and a little bit of your remit at ScottLogic.
Yeah, thanks, Mario. And I'll try not to make this sort of war and peace, because as per, and thank you for the intro, because I'm very lucky and fortunate, and I've had quite a diverse sort of career background. I started off in the sort of classic computer science degree, and then went into development roles, and then sort of realized, as much as I enjoyed programming, I didn't want to be a programmer for my whole career. So specifically worked on my communication skills, negotiation skills, sort of architecture sort of skill set. And so then kind of moved into architecture roles across a range of different industries. Done a few consulting roles. This is my third consulting role. But previously I was a big four consultancy, and then a big scale-up American tech company in the cybersecurity space. And now, I find myself at ScottLogic. So I'm drawing on a number of sort of different skills, I suppose, and different industry experiences. And I just love consultancy because it's, it gives you a variety of different things that you do in any given week. And so my role at ScottLogic is predominantly technology strategy and research and development, but I also do quite a lot of sort of pre-sales with clients, sort of shaping proposals and engagements, and do a lot of the research and development side of things, particularly on sustainable technology and also emerging technologies like AI.
Oh, perfect. Well, we always start with a question from our previous guests, and the question you have is from a chap called Vikram, who is chief architect of a business called Tenerity. What was the hardest problem you have helped solve for your organization, and how did you go about arriving at a solution to get it done?
This is a really interesting question, so I love it. But I guess I will talk quite honestly, I suppose, about one of our big challenges from last year. So last year as a consultancy, the market for consultancy was tough, as I'm sure most consultants would tell you. And we had a period of time where we had a significant number of people on the bench at ScottLogic. And so, I was working with our consultancy leaders to work out what blend of research and development, upskilling, kind of useful work we would get the bench doing. And I'm pleased to say we successfully did a whole lot of R&D activity, which has now led to a bunch of things that we'll talk about in this podcast episode. Agentic AI framework that's open source, the tech carbon standard that we worked on, and an ESG analysis tool using AI, which we might have time to talk about as well. So I guess the big problem was, how do we make sure we make the best use of this amazing talent we've got sitting on the bench. And so, yeah, kind of overseeing that research and development program, bearing in mind that Scott Logic hadn't really done any R&D. Sorry, that's unfair. We've done a bit of R&D, but certainly not the scale that we needed to last year. So that would be my Scott Logic answer. I'd probably give you a different answer depending on other roles, but that would be Scott Logic.
Fair enough. And you touched on sort of our next question there, because I ask everybody this question, and part of what I do is trying to identify what would make a good architect. And you mentioned there you had, some people on the bench, some great talent on the bench. What do you think makes a great architect in today's world?
I think in today's world, it's got to be critical thinking skills, right? The ability to look through what the vendor or maybe general narrative is, and do the classical it depends things as an architect, right? And go, does this actually work for my industry and my organization or my problem, or actually am I being blinded by sort of marketing? So I think that for me is the one critical thinking skill is super important. I think it's always been important to architects, but I think increasingly so as we get even more bombarded, I suppose, with tech messaging that doesn't necessarily always align with the best interests of the organizations that we work for.
Yeah, agreed. And just really hard to assess that, isn't it? When you're meeting people at interview, you can go.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like, do they have a slightly contrarian view on things, right? Or are they just sort of repeating what Gartner and AWS and other big people are saying, or do they have their own sort of personal take on things and stories that yeah? So that, but you're right, it's a harder thing to assess.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on to your sort of, I suppose, specialist topic, if anybody sort of looks at your background, and that is around sustainable technology. For those that don't know what it is, what does sustainable technology actually mean in practice to you, and how can businesses implement it without compromising performance?
Yeah, I guess there's quite a lot to unpack there. I guess sustainable technology is a little bit overloaded because I think it can mean three things depending on the context. One is sort of things like renewable energy and solar and wind turbines and so on and so forth. That's clearly, I mean, I've touched on that in a previous energy and climate consultancy role, but that's clearly not the main thing I'm talking about these days. I think there's two other definitions that are more relevant to sort of technology architects. The first is what McKinsey describes as like a defensive play, which is, how do I reduce the impact of my technology? How do I stop reduce the amount of CO2 or water consumption or electronic waste that's created as a result of my company's operations? The other side is the more offensive or proactive play around using technology to solve sustainability challenges. So that might be helping you prepare your sustainability reports, complying with regulation. It might be spotting greenwashing in your supply chain, or detecting sustainability issues in your supply chain. So I think there's those three lenses, and then we need to unpack sustainability there as well, because it doesn't just mean hugging trees and the environment. As important as the environment is for businesses, it's a balanced scorecard kind of approach. I think the companies that do this right, and it's looking at your environmental impact, your cost, your people, so the skills. So in a tech sense, there's a Venn diagram that I draw which has classical technology things in it, like tech debt, skills, legacy systems support, all that sort of, risk management, security, all of that sits in one circle. In around tech sustainability in general terms, how sustainable is your tech platform in technology terms? That overlaps with an environmental part of the Venn diagram that talks about the things I just talked about. And also a cost, a circle. And if you get this right, you're doing win-win-win, right? You're doing things that reduce costs, that reduce risks, and reduce impacts to people and planet. Now, not always possible. We can perhaps talk about some examples where these things conflict. But in general, there are loads of things that organizations can do that do align all three of those things. I just think unfortunately, it's been used, I think, unfairly as a divisive sort of tool that goes, there's a camp of people over there and they're activists and hippies, and there's other people over there that are the ones that make money. And that's just too polarizing a view that I'd love to challenge.
You mentioned, some examples around how they can balance that sort of operational and financial and so on, and technology. Give us one.
Yeah. Okay. So the one biggest one that most organizations can do today is go and look at cloud. right? So cloud deployment is super easy, which is great, right? Because it means we can be agile, we can spin up services. Unfortunately, it also means that there's an awful lot of waste there. Like, most organizations, if they seriously audited and assessed their cloud spend, they could reduce that significantly. Most stuff's underutilized. And the other thing you can do very quickly with cloud is look at what region you're hosting your services in, right? There are some regions that are far more carbon intensive than others. And in some cases, this is where this conflicts, right? Sometimes you might make a choice to go, do you know what, I'm going to choose a more environmentally friendly region, like an EU region, over an American region. And I'm going to do that because even though it possibly costs me a bit more money, it's more sustainable. So sometimes these things, as I say, don't always align, but in a lot of cases, Mark Butcher's stuff on this is great as well, by the way. So Mark Butcher talks about the fact that if you ask people to go and save cost in cloud and do the whole FinOps thing, right, you'll get some success. But actually, if you ask people to go and look at environmental sustainability and cost, his work has shown that people, and to be quite frank, our work has shown as well, people care about that a lot more than saving money.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, we sort of talk about saving money. If people cared about saving money, there wouldn't be this waste in the first place because people would be more diligent and more conscious. But as soon as I think you add in another driving force, you get cost saving as a result because people are looking at waste in a different way than just looking at it from a pure cost play.
For a different lens, yeah, fair enough. And what's the role of an EA in driving those sustainability initiatives through better system design and resource optimization?
So I think the enterprise architect is the guardian of the architecture, right? And I think in many cases the enterprise architect has had to fight for non-functional requirements like security, like resilience. And I see sustainability as yet another one of those, which in a lot of cases aligns quite nicely. I'll give you another example of alignment. So security, often things are far more complicated than they need to be. There's more hardware than there needs to be, systems complexity. If you can make simpler systems and you can make them, you can rationalize them down, that's less hardware that can be attacked.
Yep.
So if you can come up with simpler architectures that still achieve the same business outcomes, there's less potential security vulnerabilities in that architecture. So there are ways that you can kind of bring people along on the journey that align, and I think the architect is a really important role here to help with those trade-off discussions. Like, right, we want to have test environments, or we want to have kind of resilience, which means we need more infrastructure. Well, can we have a conversation about how much resilience we need? Not everything needs to be a platinum or gold service. So let's have that sensible conversation. Because unfortunately, I see I'll make a sweeping generalization here for a moment, but I do see people kind of making choices that is low risk to them from a career perspective, right? So I'm going to gold plate everything because that way nothing will ever go down and no one will ever point the finger at me saying, oh, it's your fault, Oliver, that this system's gone down, you're fired. Now, the reality is far more nuanced than that, right? And actually, we're wasting a lot of resources because we're over provisioning. And so I think the architect is that person in the room who can go, do you know what? I can see the bigger picture here, and I'm going to sort of make the case for sustainability being seen at the same sort of level as security or resilience or accessibility or all those sort of other non-functional requirements. I think, but for me, it'll be a success when there is less demand for my talk track at conferences because it's just been woven in as another sort of, I genuinely do, like it'll be a good thing. I can retire quite happily then, knowing that we're taking like the bigger picture more seriously, right? And that's kind of where we are as an architecture profession, I think, is in trying to get that woven into our ways of working in those trade-off conversations.
That simplification is also sort of future-proof. Not that you can ever future-proof because of the way the world is constantly moving, especially within technology. But simplifying the estate is creating a more sustainable technology landscape, not necessarily from an ESG perspective, but more from if we do want to make any changes in the future, it's going to be a lot easier to make those changes than
the agility, the agility benefits for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. So how do emerging regulations, and there's a recent one which I know you want to talk about, and corporate ESG goals shape the way companies think about technology sustainably?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at regulations. You can see them as sort of a burden and, just an annoyance, quite frankly. I think some people see them that way.
Yeah.
I think then the other way to look at them is to sort of see them as guiding constraints that drive different innovation. Because I think if you look at a good example right now around sort of our energy consumption, like, the easy thing to do would be just to start, taking more of a fossil fuel approach because That's a tried and tested approach, but the harder path, which ultimately I believe will gain benefits, is to go down more of a renewables and battery storage and better distribution sort of infrastructure stance. So if you look at that physical world for a moment, there are some sort of tough choices that we have to make. Sorry, Mary, I've lost track of the question. Remind me where we were.
How do emerging regulations and corporate ESG goals shape the company's way?
Yeah, sorry, I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole there. You might want to edit that bit out. So yeah, I think if you look at regulation as an obstacle, then that sort of sets you up already to sort of see it as a box ticking exercise. I think the organisations that get this right are the ones that see regulation as sort of guardrails for better innovation. Yeah. And so and ultimately look at it for performance improvement. So we get really excited about working with companies that don't just want to do the box ticking regulatory reporting thing around carbon, for example. They actually use it as a means to go, do you know what? Where are there opportunities to improve our efficiency? Yeah. And we'll, back to my previous point about cost and carbon saving, like let's go and look at our estate. And many organizations are surprised, right, when we do this assessment and go, you've got 45% of your cost and carbon, quite frankly, is in end user hardware that you're refreshing every 2 to 3 years. Do you really need to refresh that every 2 to 3 years? Yeah. So I think sometimes these regulations can provide targets. It's like what isn't measured can't be managed, right? Yeah. It's kind of that whole philosophy. So I think, don't get me wrong, sometimes yes, regulations are wacky and not aligned with what people who are more professional day-to-day people in that industry understand. But I think where possible, look for the sort of opportunities in the regulation is what we try and do for sure.
What is this new regulation that's come out? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I think you're possibly talking about Tech Carbon Standard.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I'd love to say it's a regulation. It's not yet. It's a proposed standard, and it's been around for about a year. It's open source, so anyone can find it at techcarbonstandard.org, and it's on GitHub, so you can contribute towards it. But yeah, excitingly, in the last couple of weeks, the UK government, partly due to our work with UK government, have kind of listed it as a useful resource when you're designing sustainable services. So, which for us is great news, because I think a lot of people look to government to see what's the standard, particularly on sustainability, because we've been working a lot with DEFRA on something called the Government Digital Sustainability Alliance. And yeah, I mean, but the Tech Carbon Standard has been used by quite a few private sector organisations as well. Like there's some great case studies that people can go and look at from Kingfisher and DS Smith, both massive multinational organisations. And ultimately, it's been really eye-opening for them, because I think the trouble with tech is it's really nuanced when it comes to its environmental impact. Yeah. So people talk about greenhouse gas protocol scopes, like scopes 1, 2, and 3. Some people may have come across that sort of concept. And we looked at the tech space and went, that's not really helpful for tech, because there's just so many bits of the tech ecosystem, from the end user hardware you buy to the cloud services you consume to the apps that you're creating for people to kind of use your services. So that's why we created Tech Carbon Standard, because we wanted something that made it easier for people to navigate this world. Going back to the beginning, when I talked about this defensive play that we can all take, which is how do we reduce the impact? The first thing you need to work out is where is my big hotspots, where if I heat map my world, what does it look like? Yeah. And I think a lot of people assume that it's in the running service, it's in my servers, because that's I think people in the news, people are going, oh, data centers are bad and all this sort of stuff. And don't get me wrong, they are a significant kind of drain on energy and resources. But actually, if you take a bigger picture view, as I said just now, it turns out actually end user hardware can be as much as kind of operational services, which for a lot of companies is really surprising. They're like, wow, and so it depends. The classic architect response. Yeah. It depends on your organization, right? If you're a big B2C company and you've got a big e-commerce presence, then of course making coding changes that make your e-commerce website more efficient are going to be huge, because you've got millions of users. But for other firms, it's going to be more simple things like, as I say, extending the lifespan of your devices is a big thing that a lot of organizations can do.
Okay. And speaking about sustainability, and everyone is now talking about AI. Yeah. From an ethical perspective, what does responsible AI development look like, and how can companies ensure they're using AI ethically?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a bit about this in 2023, and there's sort of the NIST risk management framework is a really good sort of place to go and look at if you want the sort of more, detailed view on this. But
Yeah.
there are a bunch of things here that I think a lot of organizations aren't thinking about, in the rush to sort of adopt AI.
Yeah.
The bias is a really big one that people talk about. The reality is human beings are biased, and all this is based on written material that human beings have written. So, kind of being a little bit mindful of that bias. Not really accepting closed models, I think, is possibly quite a controversial statement. Like I see
Yeah.
loads of organizations right now just adopting things like OpenAI, which are ironically named, right? Because they're actually closed AI in
Yeah.
that the reasoning models, for example, you can't. I think only recently they've announced that they're opening up access to the thinking, in air quotes,
Yeah.
process, right? And DeepSeek came along and showed that that could also be opened up, as well as DeepSeek being far more open. So
Mm.
I think, a lot of customers I talk to, a lot of clients I talk to, there's concerns about, how is this thing making decisions? How can I get an audit trail out of it? How is it transparent? And so I think, there's as much sort of audit trail as you can put around these things, even if it's just what were the inputs that went in, what were the outputs. Obviously there's privacy constraints here, so you may need
Yeah.
to obfuscate private data, but you need to sort of collect that telemetry in order to
Hmm.
understand, is this thing performing? Because I think there's way too much. Let's just slap some stuff in, and oh, it looks like it's working. The
Yeah.
trouble with this technology is it's this phrase that gets thrown around a lot. This non-deterministic
Okay.
properties of the technology means that it's more human-like, right? Like if I ask you a question, Mario, you might give me a different answer depending on how you're feeling on any given day, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
We're using technology now that is almost like that. It's not it's
Yeah.
not it's not emotional, but it will, based on probabilistic of it, probability of its models, give
Hmm.
you different responses to similar questions.
Yeah.
So we have to start designing systems that are, and architecting systems that kind of leverage that capability
Yeah.
and manage its downsides. So ironically, sometimes you almost need to start looking at human policies, like employee type policies, and going,
Yeah.
right, what's the equivalent of almost like the behavioral. If an employee misbehave, we put them on, a verbal warning, a written warning, and ultimately we fire them. You probably need something similar for AI models, as stupid as that sounds. As in, if they start making mistakes, okay, we need to start monitoring that. If they
Yeah.
continue to make mistakes, well, we need to start taking corrective action. And
Yeah.
if fundamentally they're incompatible with our company's ethics, culture, and operating models, then we are going to have to start looking at different models.
Yeah.
And so this is where I think organizations that get too tightly coupled in their architecture to AI models,
Yeah.
that's where that for me is something I would love architects to start going, do you know what? Is this an area of my business that I cannot absolutely be, hard coded into a particular AI model? I need some more decoupling. Like architects are great at thinking about these sort of,
Yeah.
architectural considerations like decoupling and so on. And how can I actually, you know, isolate my organization's, the blast radius from an AI model? Like, because look at what's going on geopolitically now, right? Like, who knows now what's going to happen over the next few months and years around some of these US tech companies?
Yeah.
How is your architecture sort of, what's your plan B architecturally if all of a sudden there's a particular tech company that your organization has decided almost overnight, quite
Yeah.
frankly, that you're no longer happy to do business with, or like it's not giving the results that,
Yeah.
and there is precedent for this, right? So
Yeah.
OpenAI recently has gone, we're changing the filtering mechanism in our models. Like previously, we wouldn't have answered a bunch of things, but now because of freedom of speech, we're going to answer a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
Imagine, Mario, you built an application that almost relies on the filtering of
Oh,
that model, right? It wouldn't give you certain responses because of its inbuilt properties. Well, now all of a sudden, this thing will start making your brand look really bad if someone asks it for certain things that
yeah.
previously it would have said no to. So that's just one simple example of where I think subtle changes in some of these AI technologies we're going to need to be watchful for as architects and go, right, we need to put in the guardrails, decoupling, and really think long and hard about what parts of the architecture we're comfortable being like really, welded to, and other parts we want more flexibility.
So there's two things there, isn't there? Firstly, you've got the trust element of humans and businesses trusting AI to drive
Yep.
decisions, right? So we'll come on to that in a second. But then you've
Mm.
also got this governance framework, which some people outside of architecture might see it as guardrails. Obviously, there's a reason why you do it. Let's just talk a little bit about that. How can businesses avoid that trap of blindly trusting it. I mean, does any business really just say, right, here you go, make a decision, AI make a decision for us?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think we've moved from, more recently from just generating content and like, processing language and processing images and stuff like that. And now we're into this territory of these reasoning models potentially allow us to make decisions. And just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? It's this
Yeah.
to your point, I think. And there's a separate piece I've written on some of this around sleepwalking into AI challenges recently, because you're right. I think, there's a danger that we just get stuck on this hype train that, yeah, everyone else is going to fully automate a bunch of their processes, so we should too. I think this is one of the big red flags architects should be raising in their organizations, to go, do you know what? Almost over my dead body in some cases, right? Because there
Yeah.
are some things that, to your point, there are some things you just should not fully straight through automate. I mean, if you look at algo trading, algorithmic trading in finance is probably one of the earliest examples and longest running examples we have of, of fully automated processes. And look at the sort of flash crashes and the various sort of domino cascading impacts those things have had. And that's been a relatively sort of small domain of decision making it's been
Yeah.
taking. And clearly they've had to refine the algorithms and so on and so forth. We're now potentially talking about like making broad decisions about things. And let's face it, these models are hackable, as in no one has really solved the prompt injection problem, right? As in that you and I, we have this rich conversation with the English language. We can go down many different pathways to sort of talk about the same thing.
Yeah.
And there isn't yet really an effective way of preventing an AI model being fooled. So,
Yeah.
you know, I think, yeah, I can't believe that there will be any organization in a highly regulated setting that, without serious guardrails and sort of filtering and various other things I've described in de-risking Gen AI in a paper I wrote in 2023, there's going to have to be some seriously thought out compensating
Yeah.
controls for that risk. But I think it depends, doesn't it? I mean, if you're in a consumer industry and you've got to react and you've got to move fast, then your risk appetite's going to be different. Like if you don't
Yeah.
have the financial, regulatory authority breathing down your neck about consumer duty, then yeah, sure, you might go, do you know what? To generate, a birthday card, I will allow the AI quite a bit of
Yeah.
freedom in generating AI. But then don't be surprised when someone posts on social media that your birthday card generator has created something horrific, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, what are you willing to sort of, trade off in terms of risks? But I mean, yeah, I think there's a whole probably separate podcast, quite frankly, Mario, about like what we're sleepwalking into. And I would just encourage architects listening to sort of pause a little bit and try and be the voice of reason around this. Try and be the person that keeps their head when everyone else is possibly losing theirs a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that is the role of a good architect, to go, do you know what? Ultimately, I can't make this decision for you, business, but I can call out what the challenges are here and what the risks are. And ultimately, if you're prepared to sign off this risk and it's significant,
Yeah.
then fine. But please be aware. And this shouldn't be Teflon shoulders, but I think this should be, hopefully make the gravity of the situation like realize, like, yeah, look, if you feel strongly enough on something that's like heavily regulated or something that's important that
Yeah.
shouldn't be fully automated, then you need to sort of start kind of showing up in these conversations, right? Because you owe it to your organization not for them to sort of trip themselves up into something silly that could
Yeah.
have been avoided. Now, that's not to say that this technology doesn't have amazing potential. I think
Yeah.
it does, but and as I said in July last year, I just fear that we're being hoodwinked. We're being somewhat blinded by the hype to think that this thing is like a human being. It's mimicking elements of human behavior,
Yeah.
and that is very different from a human being. And I think that's the thing we have to remind ourselves, is even the reasoning. You look at it, and I've been freaked out by it many times. Right, when I
Yeah.
was playing with DeepSeek, like in January, I was like, wow, this is crazy. But then I looked at it and went, no, this is just mimicking a person thinking. It's not actually
Yeah.
thinking. We have to keep reminding our stakeholders this
Yeah.
stuff isn't really thinking. It's just using statistics. And to the degree we get philosophical here, and people might say, well, so is your brain. Sure, but humans have been around hundreds of, tens of
Yeah.
thousands of years, right? These things have only been around, at most a decade. Some of these models. So we've got to start kind of approaching this with caution. yeah, let's innovate safely. Let's do proof of concepts. Let's do pilots. Let's do all that good stuff. Let's learn the lessons. And my point earlier was, let's capture the telemetry around all of that so we can understand how well these things are or aren't performing. But let's not lose our heads in this current hype wave.
And also, let's go back to why is there a business case to use AI in some area, whatever area that is, and it's because it can add real value, whether that is creating efficiencies, whether that is increasing profitability, revenue, whatever it may, increasing sustainability. That is the true value it can bring, rather than we're going to use AI because everybody's using AI and there's this whole marketing hype around it, and whatever.
And also, Mary, I would say there's this obsession with, like, I suppose, job displacement, right? Like, how can I cut out a whole load of my workforce? Which, I think we'll see. It will be interesting to see what comes of that, because I personally think that's a mistake, and I think not investing in people may well be a big mistake that organisations make, and it'll be hard to come back from that, right? Like, I've spoken to one bank who were like, yeah, we don't want to be the bank that's known for firing a whole load of our staff, only then to realise we need to hire back again because this thing doesn't work as well as we thought it did.
Just on that note, what do you think, in your opinion, the future of the role of the architect's going to be from a talent perspective? If, because a lot of architects, like yourself, come from application or software development. And if that junior end is being replaced, as everybody's talking about, whether it is or not is a different question, but that junior end's being replaced, where's that bottom of the pyramid to feed into your mid, your seniors, and then your software architects?
Do you know what? It's a great question, and I think the architect profession has always struggled with career entry point, right? And at what point can someone take the leap from being their previous role to being an architect? And I think the future of the architect role, it's a tricky one to answer, but I think if we look at previous sort of trends and we look at cloud, because I think that's sort of the closest thing we have right now to something of a similar sort of scale and technological change. I do fear we don't know enough about the underlying infrastructure anymore, right? Like we have this challenge where we have people coming into the industry who have never had to rack a server or even necessarily knows what one is, because they just use the cloud and all that's abstracted away. So I think we almost have a similar thing here with architecture skills if you're not coming up through the ranks. However, I would argue that some of the most valuable parts of the architect skill come more from the analysis world, and I don't see that analysis world going away. I think if anything, I think almost every person in technology is going to become more of an analyst, because they're going to need to understand, where do I do the thing? Where do I get a tool to help me do a thing? Where can I almost fully automate a thing? And that sort of decision making skill, and I suppose being that human in the loop and deciding what goes where, and that I think will become one of the biggest skills of the architect, will be doing that trade-off, that options analysis of when do I use this versus this. And so, we no longer code in assembler, but we still, we've kind of made that progression away from like low level languages. We've made that progression away from the infrastructure, although I slightly shudder a little bit about the implications of some of that. So I think, we will continue. And I think the architect role will perhaps just ingest more people from delivery management, more from business analysis than perhaps it does from software engineering.
Yeah, and while we're on the topic, it'd be interesting to, obviously as a consultancy, you see many businesses and implementation, you advise on implementation. What are the most, don't give too many secrets away here, by the way, but what are the most pragmatic and impactful AI applications that you've seen in a real world enterprise environment that actually bring value?
Okay. So this is where I think they're using. We talk about Gen AI because, of course, AI is a broad field, right? And you have machine learning and everything like that. But let's just stick with Gen AI for a moment, because it's clearly what most people are talking about right now. I think there's a couple of things. One is it's where the Gen AI is being used for its language processing and language generation capability, and not being stretched too far beyond that. Another is where it's paired with other technologies like RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation, like knowledge graphs, which beautifully, and NoPath is something I would recommend everyone goes and looks at. It's a Chinese research paper that's only just come out, and it's I need to dig into it, but it's in its concept, it's how do you connect the internal large language models representation of the world with your external data. It's kind of how do you ground the LLM in your external application of it. So those deployments with clients have been where, if I'm honest, knowledge graphs kind of are a bit of a secret sauce. And in fact, the Architect Tomorrow episode on knowledge graphs is the most successful episode, because I think when people realize the power of, mapping concepts and giving them weights and strengths between them, that has a lot of similarity with the way these large language models work. And therefore, if you can kind of bring your data slightly closer to the large language model's view, and you can bring the large language model closer to your view, you find solutions that are far more grounded in reality. And so, there are some examples I can point people at. So we built a financial health check chatbot back in 2023 using knowledge graph technology, because what we did was we basically built out this relationship of what is it we're trying to do? Well, we're trying to understand someone's financial health. What do we need to do that? Well, we need to understand incomings and outgoings. What does that mean? Well, incomings and outgoings, we break that down. And then what the chatbot essentially does is it draws on the strength of the relationships within those concepts to go, I now need to ask Mario a question about his mortgage or his loan payments. But it still allows you to go, oh, but I don't understand what an ISA is, or sorry, I'm struggling to know what sort of information you want. It can still go on that meandering journey because the large language model's got the capability to talk about a broad range of things, but it's still being prompted to kind of bring the conversation back to its goal. So I think for me, that was 2023 state of the art. Appreciate now we're sort of talking about reasoning models and so on, and where we are in 2025 is we've literally just, the nice thing about this is it's all going to be public very, very soon. The source code already is in GitHub. So Infer ESG is our research funded project, which we got the Innovate UK FinTech Scotland grant funding to do. And basically it's like, the problem is, can you spot greenwashing in company sustainability reports using AI? And so we use not just AI, we use a range of different data technologies as well to take a sustainability report, any company sustainability report, analyze it, look for claims, look for exaggerated claims, and then crucially use sources of information from the sustainability world to go, what's missing from that document? So what material issues should be being reported by this pharmaceutical company, and then call out the gaps. So it's not just looking for what's there, it's looking for what's missing. And it's blown, everyone we've demoed it to has been blown away by it. And we've surprised ourselves with it, because we were a bit cynical. We were like, we're not sure this thing can do it. And don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. It's still an alpha/beta sort of status, sort of proof of concept, solution accelerator type thing. But it's impressive, right? When you use these things for what they're good at, which is processing language, then they blow it out the park. I think when you try and stretch them too far beyond that human mimicking of language and reasoning, that's when I think people start to get in hot water. And that's when you need to bring the humans back into your architecture, right? You use the humans for what they're good at, use the AI for what it's good at, which is quite frankly crunching through loads of data, loads of text, get it to do that boring, laborious stuff. But don't get it to make the decisions. Get it to present the fact that it's found to a human being, which is what we've done with Infer ESG. We present the analyst with, here's what we found, here's what you should investigate further. And would you like me to help you investigate those things further by searching the web or looking in data sets or what have you? It's that, I guess it's becoming cliche, but it's augment rather than, fully automate, I think is I think that's where we are right now. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure in a couple of years, we may well be having a different conversation. But I think right now, if you're in a heavy regulated space, you care about the reliability and your brand, quite frankly, this should be augmenting rather than replacing, unless you're willing to roll the dice on stuff and you've got sign off to roll the dice.
And it's interesting you say that about that human piece as well, because that's where, and we touched on it earlier, around governance, and not governance from making people, I suppose it's governance around aligning to business goals. And this is one thing I don't know whether AI will ever get there. I don't know. I'm not obviously a technical expert, but ultimately the role of an architect is to look at the business goals, to look at whatever the technology or whatever the transformation is, and make sure they're aligned. How do companies establish that framework to ensure that AI remains aligned to the business goals and, more importantly, ethical standards over time? Because I think, as you touched on it with the branding, you don't want to be that business that gets it wrong. Pardon me, that gets it wrong, do you?
Totally. I mean, I think we already have tools in the kit bag. Like people might roll their eyes when I say what I'm about to say, but architecture review boards do have their place, right? I mean, I'm not saying they are the only answer. Clearly, if every decision has to go to an architect review board, that's not good, and that's a sign that you don't have enough established standards or principles or kind of guardrails in place to begin with. But that's ultimately, I would hope that in most organizations now around AI, the architecture review board is where some of these really quite punchy conversations are happening about trust and many of the things we've discussed on this podcast, because that is ultimately the tool. Like there should be a senior responsible owner for for the particular application. But let's go banking, say it's a mortgage process or something. Who's the senior responsible owner in the business within the bank for mortgages? There should be a conversation happening between them and the senior responsible owner for the technology platforms in the bank, and between them they should be agreeing on right now where is the line on this technology that the bank is comfortable taking in terms of its brand reputation, as you say, in terms of its regulatory compliance stance, in terms of the environmental piece, if the bank has any kind of care about its environmental footprint, because these AI models use a considerable amount of energy and water, and at the moment, quite frankly, we're brute forcing human-like intelligence. We haven't cracked yet, and one of my little sidebar projects actually is to see how low energy you can consume with some of this AI at the moment. That's what I'm literally staring at the computer over there that I'm going to be doing over the weekend to assess this. Our human brains are still massively more efficient, right, than any of this AI right now, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not really telling you the truth. So it's those sort of conversations in architecture review boards or similar governance processes is where I think the architect can add the most value at the moment around this conversation.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks for that, Ollie. We're going to move on to our quickfire questions now. So the first one is, what advice would you give a newly appointed chief architect?
Wow, hold your nerve, I think would be the best bit of advice. Don't get too swayed by by technology vendors trying to sell you silver bullets.
Okay, perfect. I really like that. That's a new one. Any advice you wish you'd received earlier on in your career?
Yes, human relationships are actually more important than the tech.
Yeah, I had someone on a couple of weeks ago and he said exactly the same thing. He said, and architecture isn't about logic. You may think it is, and you've probably been trained to think it is, but actually you're influencing people, and without a human relationship, you cannot influence.
100%. What
do you think CIOs or CTOs actually care about?
I'm kind of wondering if I answer this one honestly and never get hired ever again. I mean, it's a tough role, right? I mean, and the turnover for that role can be, so it's a bit like, sadly, these roles can get very political, and the nature of the tenure means that sometimes you have to kind of work out what can I get done. So I think a good CIO, CTO cares about aligning technology with the business best interests. That's the best ones I've seen are certainly the ones taking that leadership role.
Yeah, and the reason I ask around CIO, CTOs is because most architecture departments and practices still sit within technology. There's a separate debate as to whether that's right or wrong, but anyway. If you could ask a CIO or a CTO one question and get an honest answer that isn't political, what would that question be?
It's probably similar to the podcast question I asked, right? Like, how are we gonna move the organization's use of tech to be more sustainable?
Oh, okay, fine, fair enough. And what's the biggest change you expect to see in the market over the next 5 years, purely from an architecture talent perspective? I know we briefly touched on this, but
so I think clearly a lot of this will depend on how much AI dominates the conversation over the next 5 years. And to the degree to which quantum, for example, potentially also starts to realize real world value, because right now it's still very much a research project. So I think the architect market, it's going to be less about, I'm going to make a bold suggestion that I think it's going to be less about sort of meta models and trying to kind of understand the entire world, because the technology will actually help you do some of that. And I think the point we were talking about earlier around kind of critical thinking and kind of stakeholder, I think it's going to get less technical, it would be my view, to your point about human influencing. I think it's going to be more about influencing the business to do the right thing and being less in the weeds of the meta models and stuff like that.
Perfect. Okay. And what's your question for our next guest then?
So my question for the next guest. Well, actually, have I just given that away? I think I probably have, haven't
You can go into yeah.
I? Sorry, Mary. I've made a bit of a issue
So,
here in the edit. So good luck. Yeah. So I guess my question for an architect is, what are you doing to help your organization realize and mitigate its environmental impact of tech?
perfect. Well, sadly, Ollie, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation around sustainability within technology. So thanks for your time and thanks for an excellent podcast episode.
Thanks, Mario. Take care.
And that's a wrap on another episode of Transformational Blueprints. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found plenty of insights and takeaways to fuel your journey. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could share it, leave a review, or give us a like. It helps us reach more people in the industry who can benefit from these conversations. Don't forget to follow Synaxia Group on LinkedIn to stay updated on new episodes. The links are in the show notes. Join us next time for more tips, strategies, and stories from some of the brightest minds in technology and transformation. Until then, take care and keep transforming.